The problem for which Vygotsky is most renowned is the problem of the relation between intellect and speech. Vygotsky showed that there is non-verbal intelligence before children learn to speak, and further that children use speech to gain assistance from an adult and subsequently to control their own actions before there is intelligent speech. As Vygotsky put it, at a certain point these lines, speech development and intellectual development meet, whereupon thought becomes verbal and speech rational.
And then these two functions interconnect with one another, each driving the development of the other, until ultimately we have speech, thought, which is beyond words. Okay? So this is the very fruitful kind of approach that Vygotsky developed. That he's confronted with the problem, the well-known question of what is the relationship between speech and thought. It's a question that goes back hundreds of years before Vygotsky, and he realised that to solve this question would be the key to understanding consciousness as a whole. A key would shed light on that, but not in itself the solution to all the problems of psychology. Of course not, because he's only looking at verbal thought, one specific and very important function of consciousness. But by resolving that problem, and that sort of diagram embodies not only a lot of experimental work, bringing forward new insights, but also a methodology. Now, a lot of writers have observed that it can be useful to slightly generalize the concept of word meaning to artifact-mediated action, because word meaning is understood by Vygotsky as an action, and words are not the only kind of artifact. Apart from symbols and symbols of various kinds, one has tools, for instance, in using a computer. In the same way, gaining understanding about the culture I live in as when I use a word in this language, or use a gesture. You know, this sort of thing that I've been learning the last few days. Now, it seems to me that this concept of artifact-mediated action contains everything that is essential to the development of human intelligence, with maybe one exception, which I'll come to. It is a concept of activity. And so I think I'm justified in referring to Vygotsky as an activity theorist. I mean, what else is this? And what is an action if it's not a unit of activity? Now, just looking at the idea of an artifact. I use this word a lot. It's discussing, I can't remember the name, sorry, but with some people last time about what word can you use to represent this concept which we find in Vygotsky's theory. I'm using artifact. It's imperfect because a word which disappears into the ether as soon as you utter it is an artifact, as much as if you chisel it in stone. But archaeologists, for instance, make a business of digging down and grabbing little bits of pots and scratches here and fork there or a vase or something, and piecing together the activity of an entire civilization based on little bits that they find in the ground. Now, those items they find, the artifacts, are only meaningful in the context of how they're used in some civilization. Like the Rosetta Stone are utterly meaningless at first, apart from this magnificent accident of finding the languages all joined together. Someone translated it before it was all forgotten. But what this means is it's pointing to the opposite, that the activity of a certain society is going to be inscribed on the artifacts it uses and leaves behind. So consequently, when we use an artifact to collaborate with somebody else, there are really three parties to that collaboration. Me, the person I'm collaborating with, and the rest of the community, out of whose culture this artifact is chosen. And that's really the foundation of Vygotsky's contribution to activity theory. Because he understands that the use of an artifact involves that third party. For example, whenever we use a word or a concept like holiday, you can't think of the word holiday in an emotionally neutral way. Oh God, I'd like one. Or, like the letters AWB came up in something we're looking at yesterday. It has nothing to do with that party that you have here. But if I say AWB, how can you hear that sound, let alone if I draw the little emblem up on the board, without emotion and summoning up from you an appropriate orientation? So the thing is that artifacts, which are part of a culture, are not just objects for cognition and knowledge, and that kind of idea of the dry, emotionless artifact. And the myth, in fact, it's not a very widespread myth because it's just so wrong, but the myth that Vygotsky and those interested in this theory aren't concerned with emotions. Because emotions are written into all the symbols we use just as much as they are names that point us to a body of theory. And our activities are as much driven by, in fact, probably more motivated by emotion than they are by understanding. Now, so Vygotsky used this unit of word meaning or artifact-mediated action to understand intellectual development, how a person appropriates the ways of their culture for their society. I want to turn to another one. This is the Russian word, it's an untranslatable Russian word, which I think you'd say Perezhivanie or Perezhivanie. And the nearest, to try and translate it into English, we don't have an English equivalent, but everyone agrees that it's close to the meaning of the German word Erlebnis. And I was questioning Kai before to confirm my understanding here. Erlebnis can be plain Erlebnis, or it can just be Erlebnis. It can be a mass noun or a countable noun. We would probably, after you hear a linguist, so you know what I mean. You know, like machinery. You can have lots of machines, but you just have some machinery. Right? And Perezhivanie, because Russians don't have definite and definite articles, Russians can never really explain to me whether it's a mass or countable noun, whatever they're talking about. But it's really important, if we're to understand as a unit of analysis, that it's intended as a countable noun. That is to say, one has whatever the plural of Perezhivanie might be. My Russian is nothing, right? Now, the Perezhivanie is a unit for the development of character. I use, thanks to Kai again for some advice about this, that I take it as somewhere between a trauma and an adventure. And apparently you do this in German by saying a traumatische Erlebnis. In other words, Erlebnis, and I think Perezhivanie, because there's often good correspondence between the Russian and the German, is a word that doesn't carry the kind of definite connotations that adventure, positive, or trauma, negative have in English. But it's a word that covers those, right? And this is the unit for the development of character. And Vygotsky's theory of this is that you have this adventure or this trauma, and which may mean nothing to you. Your parents, as a teenager, send you out to spend a week in the wild, hoping that this will cause development of your character to stop being a impulsive teenager and become a well-adjusted young man. Right? But the question, will it happen or won't? And according to Vygotsky's understanding, he uses the word catharsis, which is not, as I understand, quite the normal meaning we use catharsis, but it's the reflection upon the Perezhivanie, which is the foundation for the development of character. That is to say, you go through certain lived experiences, it's a literal translation of Erlebnis, and to the extent that you reflect on them, then your character develops. Now, in word meaning, there's no use to trying to understand that development. That's, the development of verbal speech won't contribute very much to Erlebnis. You can go through a traumatic experience without words being in the picture at all. Now, the third concept that Vygotsky used or selected to deal with another aspect of the development of human being is the social situation development. Now, there's not a single word for this, but this is a very specific concept. And really it's a trap. The social situation of development, I think, is most clearly captured with the idea of a trap. It's not a sum of the factors of social advantage and disadvantage. Right? Where you are in the sibling order, what's your parents' profession, wealth or poverty, what disease. No, that's the kind of approach that modern sociology would use, the various factors which influence someone's growing up. What Vygotsky has is a concept, and it's best characterized as a trap. It goes like this, that at a certain point in your development, you're adopting one of the roles which the particular society you're a part of expects of a child, of roughly, broadly, within some elastic range. And that brings with it the perception of those around you that you have certain needs and they need to be met in a certain way. For instance, you need to be carried from one place to another because you're too young to walk, you need to have sloppy food, or because you haven't got teeth yet, and so on. Now, within that system of relations and activity, corresponding to whatever stage of self-awareness the child has at that moment, you have certain needs, but out of that arises different needs. And in fact, the role that you're playing and the role that those meeting your needs around you, the way they're acting towards you, providing for your needs, becomes transformed into really an insult. You're being confined. Your needs are no longer not being met. The way that your needs are being met is a barrier to the satisfaction of new needs that have been developed within that system of relations. So the child then is confronted with having to make a development. That is to say, they have to overthrow the conditions in which their needs are being met and adopt a new role and oblige those around them to treat them in a different way. They have to grow from being a preschooler, for instance, to being a school child. You go from being the youngest child in the family to being respected as a citizen. Now this is, by its nature, a potentially quite traumatic experience for a child, because a child does not know how to behave above their age.
For example, a teenager who's raised in a family of a certain social position, inculcated with certain social attitudes, wants at a certain point in their life to find a new social position and opinions on everything. But they have no basis, no life experience from which to criticize their parents, so they might simply refuse to give reasons for denouncing their parents and the values in which they have been raised. This is especially true where children have been raised in obedience and are especially ill-equipped to make rational criticism. An example Vygotsky gives, which illustrates how the social situation of development is both subjective and objective, concerned a widow who became a drunkard. Her 3 children each responded differently. The baby was unaffected because it was not old enough to know. The child became extremely distressed and suffered developmental damage, whilst the oldest child, a young teenager, made a development and took on the role of head of household and carer for her mother. Thus, each child was in a different situation, although each was formally in the same circumstances. Now, I would say that the foregoing account provides a coherent definition of activity as artifact-mediated actions in a situation in which people collaborate towards shared ends. But to bring out the difficulties which arise here, let us briefly review the history of the concept of activity as it was received by Vygotsky. Activity has always occupied a left-wing position in which philosophers have used it in opposition to fatalism and determinism, domination and skepticism as part of a monist philosophy. Its prominence in Vygotsky was no exception. The first to introduce activity as a concept in philosophy was the Romantic philosopher of history Johann Gottfried Herder. Herder critically appropriated Spinoza's monism, which was tied to Descartes' mechanical conception of nature, and consequently locked human life into a mechanically determined fatalism. With the idea of a nature filled with opposing forces, striving and conflict, Herder freed humanity from determinism without introducing an extra-mundane spirit or anything of the kind. Johann Gottlieb Fichte was a critic of Kant who tackled Kant's dichotomy between appearances and things in themselves by making his fundamental category activity or practice. Activity is both subjective and objective, so Fichte overcame Kant's dichotomy without resort to faith. A young follower of Fichte, Moses Hess, used activity as a means of appropriating Hegel without recourse to a spirit manifesting itself in human life. And it was from Hess that Marx adopted activity as the substance of his philosophy. And Vygotsky acquired the concept from Marx. So activity has a long and distinguished history, and each of the philosophers who have used it have further developed the concept. But all these philosophers only used activity as the substance of human life. Human life is nothing but activity. The point is, what is the unit of activity? To illustrate this problem, recall that the reflexologists who ruled psychology at the time Vygotsky came along held that everything is a reflex. But this actually contributed nothing to the understanding of the behavior of animals, except to give an assurance that it was all explainable without a life force or soul or any such extra mundane force. But it was only Pavlov who precisely defined the conditioned reflex, abstracted from all particulars, that allowed the S to R relation to become the foundation of neurobiology, that stimulus to response, though the concept has been greatly developed since. The point is, it is one thing to identify activity as the substance of a philosophy, a general view that everything is activity, but another thing to identify units of activity. The unit of artifact-mediated collaborative action is a unit of social life, which also makes it possible to see how culture is acquired and recreated in the life of a community. But beyond that? Now, for a moment, I want to step outside the Marxist tradition and call on a concept from the founder of philosophical hermeneutics, Hans-Georg Gadamer. It was Gadamer who coined the expression hermeneutic circle. Suppose you are confronted with a document, maybe an ancient manuscript or a letter from an old friend. You want to understand it, interpret it. Sometimes interpretation presents enormous problems, and different people can get very different things from the same text. Speaking for myself, I've often returned to a work I long ago dismissed as worthless, only to find great wisdom in it. For the purpose of understanding a document, Gadamer takes the context as tradition in which the document is produced. It may have been written in certain social circumstances, but in order to understand it, what is important is the tradition to which it belongs, where the writer was coming from, so to speak. That tradition may be very different from the tradition in which the reader has been raised. I was raised as an atheist. I have some difficulty relating to Christian literature, but it is not impossible. The hermeneutic circle goes like this. I read a sentence and it makes very little sense to me, but I make an interpretation of its meaning based on a presumption of the tradition from which it comes. As I read on, something surprises me, and I'm forced to revise my presumption of the tradition from which it comes. Then I have to reinterpret the sentences I have read. As I read on, I might change my mind about this tradition, and so on. We go from the detail to the whole and back again until we have an interpretation which tallies with what we find in the detail. How we interpret the detail depends on what we take to be the tradition in which it is written. And we only get to know about that tradition from what we find in the detail. That's the hermeneutic circle. But that does not exhaust the problem of interpretation. If something is written from a point of view and based on assumptions that are foreign to us, how can we avoid everything produced in that tradition being foreign and useless to us? And yet our entire legacy is like this. In fact, even that letter from an old friend is like that. We all speak from different assumptions, different traditions. How do we hear what others are saying? How do we get anything useful from a conversation? The answer Gadamer gives is very wise. He says, when we try to understand a text, we do not try to transpose ourselves into the author's mind, if one wants to use this terminology. We try to transpose ourselves into the perspective within which he has formed his views. But this simply means that we try to understand how what he is saying could be right. If we want to understand, we will try to make his arguments even stronger. Gadamer requires that some basis of continuity be found between the writer's tradition and the reader's tradition, rather than by an active imagination placing themselves within the writer's subjectivity. A real basis for continuity, common concerns, can be found within the reader's own tradition, which actively furthers some underlying aims and presuppositions of the writer's tradition. The task of activity theory is to solve a similar problem. How can we understand someone's actions as rational, given the activity or tradition in which they are acting? In this sense, we are using a concept of activity like the concept of tradition in which Gadamer is using. The context of practice in which the actions people make sense. To make sense of people's actions, we have to understand the activity or tradition or culture or institution or project or concept of which they are a part. And if we ourselves are not part of that tradition, dig down to something in it that we too support, so that their action makes real sense to us. On that basis, then, we can solidarize with them at some level. Even tradition is meeting the needs of its people in some way. So the concrete action they take either makes no sense to us or we oppose it. But any real tradition is meeting the needs of its people in some way, and there is always some level at which we can solidarize with what motivates someone's actions. This is my introduction to the problem of motivation. Even though humanity is universal, there are a basic set of needs we all have. Different cultures go about things in quite different ways. Different cultures have quite different needs, and in turn, they will construe your actions very differently. Some of Vygotsky's followers have claimed that Vygotsky had not accounted for motivation. It's all very well to show how someone had learned a concept by using an artifact to complete some task, but what motivated them to complete that task in the first place? Surely what someone is trying to do is the central problem of understanding human activity, and lack of motivation for a particular learning task is the greatest barrier to learning. Isn't the generation of motivation to carry out the various tasks required for the reproduction of a society central to the whole social fabric and organization? In the view of these critics, it was necessary to form a concept of the societal activity which is the source of motivation for an action. Before entering into sociological territory, let us look at how individuals become motivated. The standard answer is that someone is motivated for an action because the action satisfies some need they have. However, all this does is shift the question from the action to the need. Now, we must all grant that in respect to a range of biological needs, this shift is warranted. We eat because we are hungry, we sleep because we are tired. And also, these basic needs extend beyond the immediate sphere of consumption. Meeting basic needs in a modern capitalist society usually means finding a job or some other vocation, and thus the meeting of basic needs does penetrate society. But this is actually a very limited sphere. And for example, it is unlikely that a child attends school in order to eat when they reach adulthood, nor is it likely that a writer writes in the hope that it will put food on the table. And insofar as motivation is provided by biology, it is rarely a problem for educators and psychologists. Nevertheless, in the long run, any society that fails to meet the basic needs of its citizens for food, warmth, security, and so on must perish. But there are many ways of achieving these ends. Let us hazard a guess at a basic rule of thumb. In order to meet their needs, whether basic or not, a person must participate in some project which is able to sustain itself in the given social context. The problem of motivation is then shifted to the problem of what motivates a person to participate in some role in any existing project. Let's take it as given that in lending their efforts to a project, the individual does not know the ultimate aim of that project, or more generally, that the ultimate outcome of a project is in general unknown. The end of a project is imminent in the project itself, and everyone participating in it only learns as the project itself unfolds. Nonetheless, either the project fits in with a project the person can commit to, and they decide to join the project on its merits, or something must be done in order to entice or oblige the person to join. Equally, at the same time as offering motivation for a person to participate in some project, participation will entail demands being placed upon the person. Everyone participates in a project with their own agenda, their own understanding of the project. The reason for using this terminology is to get away from the dichotomy of objective and subjective motives, which is a dead end. The aim is to approach the problem with a unit of activity which is both subjective and objective, and the idea of a project does this, provided one allows that the end of a project is not purely and simply given, that is emergent or imminent within the project, that the end of the project is subject to interpretation. The fact is that in learning the concept of a given community, one acquires the motivations which go along with them. How is that possible? Well, I think that every concept is a project at one or another stage in its life course. A twinkle in the eye of an agitator, a powerful social movement, or a fossilized institution. To acquire a concept in a given social context is not just to understand it, but to acquire also a motivational orientation towards it. When we learn something, we do not just acquire another word for our dictionary, but also develop in terms of motivation and will. That said, we retain will and motivation that rests on pre-intellectual bases within the psyche, and we do not acquire new motivational resources on a blank page. But in general, motivation is formed in the cultural and practical environment. In fact, one could almost say that the motivational structure of a person is the projection of the life around him or her. It is impossible to disentangle subjective and objective. So if we return to the question of whether Vygotsky provided an account of how people acquire motivation, it seems that he did more than he was given credit for. When people acquire a concept in the context of a specific collaborative project, then they also acquire the motivational structures relevant to that concept. How can one acquire the concept of thief or holiday without also acquiring the motivational orientation in relation to them? Also, take some ideal that is supposed to provide motivation for someone, education, profession, prosperity, nation, or whatever. None of these ideals are empirically given to the senses, but can only be apprehended as concepts through words. The intellect, which is the seat of all the motivations associated with life in modern society, knows only concepts of one kind or another, generalizations. The nation, for example, does not exist as such, independently of its concept. If patriotism is to form any part of a child's motivation, it will only be through the words, images, and other artifacts that they learn as concepts, in collaboration with another, through artifact-mediated collaborative actions, in other words. We have no sixth sense to perceive such abstractions, but must perforce use concepts. Nonetheless, the sociological dimension to the life of the community requires tools of its own, and we require a concept which is compatible with Vygotsky's units. But Vygotsky's unit of action does not lend itself to the solution of social problems properly so called. Let us take it that we agree that the substance of our philosophy is activity, that is, that everything is activity. But just as everything is a reflex, this solves nothing for neurobiology outside Pavlov's study of the unit of neurobiology, the reflex are. So no progress can be made in social questions until we have a unit of activity. What is an activity? Before pursuing this question, I will very briefly outline two of the most influential answers that have been given to this question, that of A.N. Leontiev and Euro Engström. Alexei Nikolaevich Leontiev developed a three-level anatomy of activity. At the center is the action, understood just as Vygotsky had proposed. An action which has become second nature, such as stepping over a curb or reading signs as you're walking along, is called an operation, and this is automatically adapted to the conditions required to complete the action. If something goes wrong, it is transformed from an unconscious operation to a conscious action. But all these actions are always directed towards the completion of an activity, of which the action is a part. The activity is societal and includes the actions of many people. The motivational physiology is as follows. Operations flow autonomously from the will to complete the action, and an operation is selected according to its conditions. The action is oriented to the individual's goal and collectively realizes the activity. The societal activity has an ongoing social motive, independent of the will of the individual. The individual's goals may not coincide with the social motive, but the individual will be aware of the motive, so as to coordinate his or her actions with others for the achievement of the motive of the activity. There are two classic examples which are given to illustrate these relations. The first is that of the primeval hunt, in which a beta chases game away so that other members of the group may catch them. The beta's action only makes sense because they will receive a share of the catch as part of the social system of distribution. The activity is the hunt, and its motive is said to be objective, as it is the motive of the whole community. The second is that of the factory worker, who is aware of the product he produces, of its meaning, or Bedeutung in German, at least to the extent required for him to be able to perform his labour functions in a rational way. But it is not the same as the personal meaning, in German Sinn, of his labour, which lies in the wages for which he is working. The problem I see with this are, one, that identification with the social group is not given as it is for the tribal group. It may arise only through participation in a common project. Two, that the idea of an objective social motive relies on the notion of a unitary society with a rational government determining the objective needs of a community, whereas in fact the members of the government pursue ends of their own, and the same goes for capitalist employers. Three, the hired worker is presumed to be interested only in the wage as a means of purchasing, means of enjoyment, and or share in the objective motive, in the case of the employer being the state. Altogether, I think there is too much of a dichotomy, and the motives of individuals, whether managers or labourers, seem to be taken for granted. Further, I think there is no such thing as an objective motive. But for Leontief, an activity is defined by its objective motive, so we get a picture of society very much resembling a centrally planned economy. Euro Engström has developed a widely used schema for activity represented in the following model. This elaborate schema is developed by beginning with the relations between an individual subject, the community, and the environment, in which each mediates the relation between the other two, and then this mediation takes on an independent objective form through tool-making, social rules, and division of labour. This is called a system of activity, or an activity, which constantly expands through mediation and transforms itself as each object is realised as an outcome. The merits of this approach is that it provides researchers with a template which both allows them to ensure that all the relevant factors are taken account of, and provides a continuity which binds all researchers using this methodology into a community with common reference points. The problem I have with this model is that it has finally abandoned Vygotsky's approach of creating a base for the solution of any problem by identifying a unit of analysis or concept of the problem. Engström's approach requires the searcher to identify a checklist of 11 concepts before the system of activity is complete. And it has to be said, this process of identifying the rules, the community, the subject, etc., is fairly much a routine business. It's a plug-and-play device. For the purposes of an already established research program, it is quite effective, but it is not going to provide new insights, and it is quite consistent with the normal practice of positivist sociology. There is a third current of activity theory which grew up in Europe, Germany and Denmark in particular, which makes its own criticism of Leontief and does not agree with Engström's current, which is spread from Finland internationally. I know too little about this current to make any comment on it. Aside from this, many researchers use Vygotsky psychology within post-structuralist or other discourse models in lieu of a variety of activity theory. While I have my criticisms of these currents, all represent powerful variations on Vygotsky's original idea. But I want to make some suggestions in light of what I see as the strength of Vygotsky's methodology, which should be further developed. The first issue is the notion of membership of a group or community. This cannot be taken for granted in the way Leontief in particular does. In modern capitalist society, identification with the whole community is either absent or very weak. People identify themselves in a wide variety of ways. All modern societies contain a myriad of social groups of various kinds, sizes and strengths, which overlap and compete for the loyalty of members. I don't think it makes sense to assume that an individual belongs to one and only one such group, which provides the motive for all the activities a person participates in. Or if we allow that participation in a system of activity coexists with other loyalties, that this system is self-evident and coherent. Group membership is weak in modern societies, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world. Moreover, it seems far more rational to me to begin from an activity and then trace the formation of group loyalty and culture arising from collaboration, whether in pursuit of a common end or simply through collaboration as such. But I do agree that the only rational way of understanding what an activity is the ideal or objective of the activity. So adopting the word project for an activity, we know that every project is oriented to the realization of an ideal. But exactly what this ideal may turn out to be, that is, what is actually realized by the project, is not something given in advance, it is actualized. And in the course of collaboration, everyone gets to know more about that idea, which is embodied in the project. What we have then is not a society made up of one or a number of social groups, whether understood as ethnic communities or institutions of some kind, but a social formation whose fabric is woven of numerous threads, some emergent, some contested, some institutionalized. The complex structure of motivation in a person's mind is made up of the interplay of the various concepts reflecting these ideals. As suggested by Engstrom, every research project analyzes some situation. So every research project analyzing some situation must take account of the social rules. But these rules arise from multiple sources. Some the same source as the object of the activity system, but some are overlaid and have a different source. And if we were to demand that all the applicable rules be taken into account in this would be unachievable. We have to accept that we cannot define a research domain without open boundaries, but that is in the nature of projects. Projects are both subjective and objective. They are what they are and exist only because people perform them and are motivated by them. But nonetheless, in the overwhelming majority of cases, they are not joined. In the overwhelming majority of cases, they are joined, not created. That is, people find them in the world around them and lend their energies to them. Let's take a couple of cases which are of central concern for everyone here. Firstly, motivation for learning in the formal school system. When a child is told that they must now go to school, who knows what that means to the child? Maybe it means that they are now old enough and as such is welcome. Or it means a chance to be with the older children they know who attend school. Or maybe it means only exposure to dangers and separation from the home, a loss of freedom and subjection to new demands. Once they are fully participating in formal school activity, the child will form a more concrete concept of what school means and may be able to commit to the project. In the meantime, the meaning of school will be framed within the constellation of meanings the child has formed within the social situation at home and the roles the child has experienced there. It depends on the concept they have of school and how that concept fits in to the whole concept they have of themselves. For a young child who has not yet learnt to think in true concepts, the concept the child forms of school will take a form according to their intellectual development. In general, prior to attending school, this concept will be related to the child's adoption of a new role, or more or less inessential attributes of attending school, which affect their well-being, or be identified with other similar activities the child has experienced. These are complex questions and I'm not qualified to resolve them really. Another example is the family. Family is a project, but its meaning changes throughout a person's life course and differs between families. But there is no doubt that raising and providing for a family and identifying with its legacy and future is a major source of motivation for large numbers, maybe even a majority of people. Certainly, family provides plenty of reasons for participation in most of the mundane projects which make life in any society possible. Family is an ideal which motivates people to participate in other projects as a means to an end, but which also gives meaning to what would otherwise be mistaken for a narrow self-interest. Instead, as a source of motivation, it is often impossible to separate self and family, so strong is their identification. Like society as a whole, the individual mind is a fabric woven of threads, each of which is a concept, both a thought form and an extended system of artifact-mediated actions whose coherence arises from the shared ideal of its collaborators. All concepts are inherently collaborative, and collaboration has norms which are well known and carry considerable moral force. These are that the participants in collaborative projects share the objective, are moral equals, and always consult one another insofar as it is feasible and make decisions by consensus. Quite commonly, not everyone will have an equal stake in or a commitment to a project, and the norms are negotiated accordingly. But there is such a thing as non-collaborative collaboration, and certain limiting cases of collaboration which are non-collaborative dominate our society. Let's outline three classic cases of collaboration. The first is collaboration as just described. The other two are hierarchy and exchange. Hierarchy solves all the problems entailed in running a project by line management, with the owner of the project at the top, commands flowing down from the top. This is a perfectly respectable form of collaboration, and people easily submit themselves to it. It is the norm within any capitalist enterprise, and in times gone by the whole of a society was run in this way. In general, all societies have status orders of various kinds, and an element of hierarchy enters into even the most informal collaboration. There has been criticism of hierarchical relations applying between teacher and student, for example, especially since the zeitgeist militates against young people accepting the superior status of teachers. Exchange is the non-collaborative collaboration characteristic of the market. Here, two parties to the collaboration each use each other as a means to their own ends, and it is understood that both pursue separate and independent projects. Nonetheless, the norms of moral equality and honesty are strongly enforced in this relation. Recently, with the corporatization of higher education, we have seen the relation between teacher and student rendered as a customer service provider relation. This is enormously destructive of education, since teachers must teach in a way which is pleasing to students and pass them in exams, whatever their performance, especially if the students have paid fees for their qualification. The whole concept of education is undermined by rendering it as a process of purchase and sale. Collaborative learning is gaining in support among higher education teachers and students. This entails collaboration both between student and teacher, and between students, and sometimes between teachers. Techniques such as project learning, problem solving, research, and Socratic dialogue are used and have proved to be very successful. Collaboration is generally the norm for voluntary organizations, but is increasingly to be found as a norm in family groups, within limits, in relations between client and carer in the health services, for example. These forms of collaboration are also to be found in capitalist society, in situations where one form of collaboration is subsumed under another. For example, an employer may run his firm as a hierarchy, but finds it more effective to leave it to the coalface workers to collaborate with one another. This has the advantage that, provided that the workers are motivated, they are much better at managing their own work than managers, and learn from their mistakes, which managers rarely do. Collaboration sometimes applies at the top as well, as collaboration invariably produces better policies. But such cases, of course, collaboration is limited to a select club. It is often simply a mask to cover a hierarchy. Conversely, voluntary organisations may operate as collaborative enterprises but employ full-time staff on a wage for certain specialist tasks, and of course purchase goods and equipment from the market. This allows effective voluntary collaboration without the downside of amateurism. In the first case, collaboration is subsumed under hierarchy. In the second case, exchange is subsumed under collaboration. Collaboration has strong normative force and always leads to more intelligent work than exchange or hierarchical command. Of course, in most cases, there is neither the desire nor any point in collaborating, and one party is happy to work for a wage and not get involved in making decisions about the place. And people are sometimes happy to let someone who has a large investment in a project to run it as they see fit. But other things being equal, the more collaborative a project, the healthier it is. That is why the health services have adopted the norm in many countries, and why employers prefer their employees to collaborate, as long as they have the final say and the profits themselves. Marx has analysed in depth the outcome of running a society along the lines of the exchange relation. Today, even the hierarchical relations which have always been the norm within capitalist enterprises are more and more giving way to exchange with the use of franchising, outsourcing and one-line budgeting. And what cannot be marketised is so far as possible left to the collaboration of those directly involved. But the results of this process of subsumption of exchange under hierarchy are not healthy. I wonder what an analysis of society in which the dominant form of labour cooperation was collaboration would look like. Thank you very much.